Hey kids, we're going to sum up this unit now on transport. We've talked about a lot of things here, from passive transport to active transport, and we've talked about even the plant kingdom. But we're going to sum up some of that transport in like resource acquisition in plants. Now, plants need basically two things: water and sunlight. Okay. Sunlight, we're going to take care of in our energy unit. We're going to go into more detail with the leaves, especially with things like the palisade parenchyma. Okay. Uh, that is the type of tissue that you find at the top of the leaves where most of the chloroplasts are going to be concentrated. So we'll mention chloroplasts here. But another important thing we want to mention with light acquisition, not just the leaves, but also shoots. Or when we mean by shoots, we mean like the stems and stuff growing towards the light, bringing those leaves up into the light. And this is why we see a lot of responses in plants that we'll talk about also in a communication unit, tropisms in plants. Okay, so that's all we're going to mention about light. We're going to really focus on water because we just got finished talking about osmosis and diffusion and water potential. So, and you also learned a little bit about xylem and phloem. So when we focus on the water and the minerals, we're really focusing on the xylem and starting in the roots. Okay, so you can see in your outline the first thing that's mentioned there is about diffusion, and I'm just going to mention osmosis. Okay, it's diffusion of minerals, osmosis of the water, and all. But we want to talk about, yes, that water potential. So water potential comes in here as well. Water potential, deciding on which way that water is going to flow. And that water potential is very low in the roots, high. Boop, 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 boop. High in roots, but lower in the stems, and lowest in leaves. Okay, this kind of sets up what we call a transport through the stem. And I don't know why I broke this into three things, but this transport through the stem is kind of set up by that water potential being like very high at the roots and then traveling upwards. But it's not all about that. And there's actually a hypothesis or a theory based on all of this. They call it the cohesion tension hypothesis. Cohesion slash tension hypothesis as to what like drives that water up a plant and all. And if you think about those two words, cohesion and tension, like surface tension, okay, it talks about water molecules sticking together. That's cohesion. Tension, I like to say surface tension, but also that capillary action where the water molecules are sticking to a solid surface, even against gravity. That crawling of the water molecules upwards, okay, is driven. Okay, so think of water potential as the driving force. Okay, but that driving force has to have a road to go along with that, and that's like the inside of the xylem walls, and that's where the cohesion tension hypothesis comes through, and that's how transport through the stem goes. Okay, and that's so that water can go from one place to another. It takes a long time, but there's also one other thing I want to talk about, and it's like that cell to cell transport in the stem. And there's two types of cell to cell transport. There's what we call apoplast and symplast. Apoplast, and we'll start on that. That's the transport that we see in the extracellular matrix area, that extracellular space. It's the transport in extracellular space. Okay, so from cell to cell, but kind of like staying outside of the cells. That happens a little bit too, okay, through that cohesion tension hypothesis. But symplast is more truly osmosis, okay? This is more like osmosis because this time it's the transport from one cell out of the cell or out of the cell into the cell. So it's out to in or into out of the cell. So it's going across a membrane, going across membrane and the cell wall for that matter, okay? So that's why that's truly more osmosis. But that too is driven by that water potential, the water potential on one side of the cell versus the outside of the cell. Okay, whether it's going to move out to in or in to out. But we needed to mention apoplast because sometimes it just doesn't go into the cell. It stays on the outskirts and just like kind of stays within that extracellular space. Okay, but all of it is driven by water potential. The cohesion tension hypothesis is how it moves or crawls through that stem. Okay, and that's how we see that. But what is actually the destination? The destination is up to the leaves because that's where photosynthesis is going to occur, right? We got to get that water up there because it's taking in that light. It's got to get the water in there. And how does the water start at the roots but get up to the leaves for photosynthesis? Okay, it has to have something that's pulling it. So what is that pull? And that's the next thing we need to mention. That's letter D in your outline. And that's transpiration. Transpiration. I like to call that tree sweat. Let's put that in quotes. Tree sweat. Okay. When the leaves release, I had to fix that. Sorry about that. When the leaves release water, okay, that's called transpiration. But what's causing it? Okay, evaporation. Okay. So transpiration is caused by evaporation from the leaves. But here's the thing. How does the water get out of that extracellular space? How does it get out of the cells? Okay. How does it do that, especially the extracellular space? Well, we got the stomata to thank for that. And if you remember what the stomata are, okay, they are the pores in the leaves. When those pores open up, water is going to be released. And a lot of times that those pores open up at nighttime. Remember that question on the review of the plants. Stomata open up at nighttime. That's when water is released. And they have to release water because it's going to have to pull the water up through the stem because some of the water is still in there, but some has to be replenished. So you have to release some of that water to keep that upwards flow going. Okay. And so that's why we mentioned letter E. Okay. The stomata. And the control of the stomata, if you remember, is by these two little cells on either side, the guard cells. Guard cells control the opening and closing, and they're controlled again by like a signaling situation that we're going to talk about with communication. Okay, how light will signal them to like shut up or close up, and the stomata is the pore in the inside. Okay, put a little arrow pointing to that. Okay, and then they basically relax or release water, and that's how they open up, and then a lot of water is released. Okay, this causes that. Okay, and all this then. Okay, we know this is the cohesion tension hypothesis, but all of this combined is what we call the transpiration stream. Transpiration stream that happens in plants. And that's how plants acquire water and the minerals. And that rate is definitely controlled by the stomata, okay? And it goes up the trees. Let's just draw a little tree here, okay, just to finish off this like little area. And we'll draw the trunk, that's the stem. We'll draw the roots, that's down here. And the transpiration stream obviously goes up. Okay, and it's caused by a number of factors. Okay, anything from that cell to cell stream that's going on, or the cohesion tension thing, the water potential being the driving force, the stomata, whether they're opened or closed, pulling that all along. So, like if I was to ask you a nice essay question to write about, how does water get from the roots to the top of the tree? Well, you'd have to say the roots, of course, are absorbing the water, but once it gets in, it's going to travel either apoplastically or symplastically. Okay, apoplastically in the extracellular fluid, or symplastically that through from one cell to the next, or from one cell out and then out to the next cell in. That's a cohesion tension hypothesis, where the water molecules are sticking together and they're crawling up the cells. This is driven by water potential being very high in the roots and very low up in the leaves. Okay, but the leaves ultimately are where it all begins. The leaves have to open up their stomata, release, let some water evaporate from the leaves. And then once that happens, it lowers that water potential there. Driving force of the transpiration stream then flows that water upwards. Okay, so finally, one more page here. Then how do the sugars get to places? Okay, so this is Roman numeral 3 in that outline. This is the final thing, sugars. If photosynthesis is occurring up in the leaves, then somehow those sugars have to flow downwards, because if you think about the leaves of an apple tree, they're making photosynthesis, but where are all the sugars going? They're going into the apples, and they're going into the flowers and the fruits and stuff. And they're moving down. Sometimes they're going all the way back down to the roots, and that's where like potatoes are storing all their starches. So what is transporting those sugars? That's the other tissue you learned about called phloem. Phloem. Okay. Interesting enough, if you remember reading about it, xylem is actually dead once it's doing its function. Like it starts out as a live cell, but then the cell kind of dies. It has very thick cell walls. In fact, when you eat celery, that stringy stuff is mostly the xylem. It's like the little, veins inside the celery, and the veins are usually the xylem and phloem. Xylem has much thicker cell walls because when they die, the cell walls are all that remain. Phloem, though, stays alive. Phloem's pushing like downwards. It's sending the sugars from the leaves, to storage parts. And those storage parts could be like flowers, fruits, stems. Some plants even store their sugars in stems, or even roots. Okay, they're not often stored in leaves. In fact, I can't think of anything off the top of my head here. Okay, but we call this from the source, and that's the leaves, because that's where photosynthesis takes place. So the source is where photosynthesis is taking place, okay, from the leaves to the what we call the sink, okay, where it all like kind of sinks down. And that would be where you just have like this storage going on, the storage. Okay, so photosynthesis is the source, and it moves from source to sink when we're talking about sugars and carbohydrates. And that's it for resource acquisition in plants, okay? You've learned enough about plants, okay? And hopefully it gives you a little bit of a basis, and that's all, folks.